Welcome, I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. A decade ago, there was a lot of hope for the future of Myanmar. Now it is a neglected and tragic military state that is fighting a civil war. Can hope return? Welcome, Robert.
Morena, Bruce.
The Southeast Asian nation of Myanmar has been under military rule since the army overthrew the democratically elected government in February last year.
Yeah.
What's been happening there since then?
Well, it's a bit of a grim picture because there were initially peaceful protests which then turned into armed opposition simply because the military regime which took over following the overthrow of the democratic government there have resorted to strong coercive tactics and killing people, and that has generated, basically, as you said in your introductory remarks, a civil war, and that more than 2,000 citizens of Myanmar have been killed in the repression that's ensued. So this is a depressing situation where a brutal military regime, which has paid lip service to the return of democracy sometime in the future, in the meantime is crushing all opposition as best it can. Now, to be fair, the opposition, which is becoming increasingly organised, has handed out a few embarrassing defeats for the Myanmar army. But that's the situation at the moment, and more recently in the headlines, of course, in July, was the execution by the military junta of 4 democracy activists who were accused of having links with armed insurgents in the country. And that led, of course, to widespread condemnation. But from the point of view of the opposition in Myanmar, not too much support.
Right. And other Southeast Asian nation leaders have been reluctant to get involved, but there's been a change. Why are they now more outspoken in their criticism of the military junta?
They've become more outspoken, but I think ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, has one of its cardinal rules. It embraces 10 countries of different political persuasions, and one of its golden rules is non-interference in domestic affairs. And so how did it respond when the military coup occurred in Myanmar? It responded by bringing the leader, Min Aung Hlaing, to meet with ASEAN officials and to try to broker what they called some sort of 5-point consensus for stability in Myanmar. The problem was that the junta didn't accept it and the opposition weren't consulted. So it was the worst of all worlds, really. ASEAN didn't actually, if you like, launch an initiative which was acceptable to the government, or the coup leaders and the opposition. So in a sense, they've struggled, and they are divided over this issue. And of course, ASEAN is subject to the pressure of a big power like China, which is close to a number of ASEAN members. So it'd be unfair, I think, to single out ASEAN for blame, because the UN Security Council has not been particularly effective either. But the reasons for that are that, quite simply, that China and Russia are both backing the coup leadership.
The rest of the world seems to have forgotten Myanmar. Is there any reason that we should care?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that the spectre of a democratically elected government being overthrown by a military dictatorship, which is effectively what it is, sets a very bad precedent. We also ought to be concerned about the fact that China and Russia are firmly behind the regime. In other words, they're strengthening the forces of authoritarianism and providing armed support for that government. And the problem is that with the UN Security Council being so dysfunctional and a bystander, effectively, the UN keeps making strong statements. It says that the execution was depraved and coming up with this sort of rhetoric, but it's very difficult for the key decision-making body in the UN to take decisive action because of the veto. And that leaves a number of Western countries, such as the United States and the UK, as well as the EU. They've all taken sanctions against the coup leaders There was some sort of embargo in place, although that's been undermined by both Russia and China. So there have been efforts, but at the moment the military seems determined to stay in power, come what may, and that may be a disincentive for a number of Western countries launching a much more concerted collective effort. And I think the other thing is a number of Western countries, such as the United States, wants to work with ASEAN and not unilaterally or bypass it, because they're very sensitive to the fact that Indochina and Southeast Asia within it is dynamic and vibrant, and they want to encourage ASEAN to take the initiative. So these more outspoken statements you referred to, Bruce, recently are encouraging, but it's difficult to see a consensus-based organisation like ASEAN really providing the leadership to put, let's be quite frank, put a lot of pressure on the military coup leaders and to nail them down to a firm timetable to a return to democracy, and that's what's required.
So is the bottom line that Myanmar, we can get on, the world can keep turning even if Myanmar is in this state and that this has happened, and so nothing is likely to really change?
I wouldn't quite go that far. I think there's a bit of watch and see. The United States had a major meeting with ASEAN leaders recently, and they have been trying to get ASEAN to be forward-leaning on this problem. The other thing is, I think the outcome of the civil war may well rearrange the furniture. That is to say, if violence continues to escalate, it may well change the situation. As I mentioned to you, the military have come off second best in some of the battles of the opposition, which is a bit ominous for a regime which is determined to stay in power. It is a fluid situation, and I think your question's a good one, because ultimately at the moment there doesn't seem to be the political will, at least there's not the united political will to really fix this problem and force the military into a situation where they have to commit themselves to leaving power and paving the way for democratic elections. At the moment, with China and Russia firmly behind the military regime, that's not going to happen. And at the moment, there's a lack of mechanisms to get around that sort of obstacle. So I think ultimately, Myanmar's future is going to be decided by the civil war.
Thank you, Robert. And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Ka kite anō.